Thank you for joining us for the April edition of the AAPI Pastors Gathering hosted by Catalyst Wellness Alliance, CWA for short. My name is DJ Chuang, the Executive Director. So glad you could join us today. And those of you watching on the recording, I'll briefly introduce our special guests and allow us to maximize our time together in learning about our topic, inviting whole person spirituality in community. We host this monthly gathering virtually for AAPI pastors around the country and around the world to engage with mental health in a safe place, especially for pastors, because pastors are at the front line of serving Asian American population in faith communities. And so we find that to be a strategic place to really address this situation of mental health, some would say crisis in our generation. And we need all the help we can get, and we want to work together. I put in the chat window, and it'll be in the show notes, the full biography of Nick and Natalie Hsieh. They are married. They live in San Diego, been married 16 years. They have been blessed with two children, a son, Nehemiah, and a daughter, Naomi. Natalie is a high school therapist with degrees from Stanford University, Bethel Seminary in San Diego, and most recently a PhD from Loma Linda University. And Nick Hsieh has ministered for nearly 20 years in English ministries of ethnic Chinese and Taiwanese churches with degrees from UC San Diego, Dallas Theological Seminary, and a Doctor of Ministry from Talbot School of Theology. With his wife, Natalie, Nick is passionate about the integration of spirituality and mental health, and specifically studied the intersection of grace, shame, and singleness in Chinese American churches. Nick and Natalie, thank you for joining us and facilitating a conversation around inviting whole person spirituality in community.
Awesome. Yeah, great to be here. Yeah, thanks for the introduction, DJ. And it's really fun. I was really excited just to reconnect with many of you and meet some of you for the first time. So I think today the tone we want to take was just to share from our life story and also ministry journey, and just to present some thoughts for all of us to discuss about this idea of bringing your whole person to church. I wrestled with what to title this, and what do we mean by whole person. I'll describe it a little bit from sharing a little bit of my own story. So I, as a DJ mentioned, uh, grew up in San Diego, and I feel like getting to know me, I'm a second generation Chinese American. My parents were the first generation Christians in their own family on either side, and they really prized their Christian identity. And so my own spiritual journey, I always start with my parents' spiritual story. And a lot of my story revolves around being a part of my family. My parents were very instrumental in planting our home church in San Diego, and that became like an extended family for me. I didn't live around a lot of cousins. I did like aunties and uncles, sisters and brothers at our Chinese church. So I think the braiding together of family, of church, of knowing God, understanding myself, navigating life was very much like connected. And I think when I think of wholeness, I realize that, as a second generation person, identity was always a question in my mind, even if I didn't have words for it. I was like, who should I show up to be at school? Who should I show up to be at home? Who should I be at church? I was always looking to the context to say, like, this is who you should show up as. And I see that there's a lot of layers that I recognize in my own life. Um, Currently, I am a high school therapist. This is actually my office I happen to use at this hour. So I see students, I come full circle, like seeing students in my office, kind of recognizing the layers of identity that fit in this season of life. But I guess coming back to my own story, I realized that for me, it was easy for me to feel like I could show up at church, and I generally was knowing the right teaching, knowing the right way to answer questions about God, or to even do quiet times or devotional time with God. And I knew generally the right path to take. But I recognize for me personally, being part of a family where we're known in the community, we're part of leadership, And there's like a sense that I need to carry the weight of just representing myself well. That was sort of an unspoken sense that I carried in as a child. And so I felt like, if I'm struggling, not only do I not really have words for it, I don't know that I can talk to the people next to me. I didn't know how to do that. There wasn't a lot of modeling around sharing just like loneliness or grief or just like words that kind of made sense of my internal experience, feeling like I'm not sure where I belong, I'm not sure where I fit in. I feel like book smart, everyone thinks I'm great, but internally I feel lost. I don't know where I fit. So I remember just like quietly like exploring other ways of meeting those needs. And that for me, I was very relationally driven. So I would try to meld and figure out how to match like my emotional needs through just like playing up or playing down the identities that matched the relationships I wanted. And this kind of came to a place of turning point when I went to college. That was when I was outside of my home space, outside of my home church. And I was like recognizing that I was like very underprepared, like emotionally, relationally, socially, to understand those aspects of my faith. And so when it came to exploring who am I outside of my home, who am I in the world, like I had a lot of head knowledge, but I had like almost zero self-awareness of my emotional needs, and also how to relate to people on a human level. Um, and so I felt like I really I had a lot of lostness, especially like toward middle school, high school, and college. So I was showing up to church just socially, kind of like managing what I needed to do to stay on track. But then emotionally, there was like quite a huge divide between my private insecurities and that world of lostness and what I was showing up to church as. So I think um, when things kind of collided, I made some choices in terms of dating that just became very painful and traumatic for me. I found that I felt like a lot of fragmentation of who I was, like sitting before God. I realized, like, how did I live these two lives? Like, where I was making choices in how I was relating to this person I was dating, and then I was still showing up to church. Like, how did I get away with that, I guess, in the mind of the time? So I think I just realized that this is just my own personal story. Everyone will kind of come into this intersection of what does it mean to show up as a full self in the church differently. For me, I felt like, as a bicultural second generation, I lived in that space of being very comfortable flexing and being a different self in different spaces. And then also feeling a little lonely and lost because I didn't quite match my parents' world. I didn't quite match my peers. And like at church, if I didn't resonate with the same way of speaking about God, I just felt very alone. So I think it was easy for me to feel emotionally isolated. And then I think it wasn't until that turning point that I felt like God really impressed on me through little by little. There were some turning points in my own spiritual journey that really allowed me to appreciate the fact that He wants my full person. That means my pain and my sorrow, my hurt, my interest in the inner life of the person, whether that's emotions, mental health, identity questioning, and social questions, that all of that matters to God. I feel like in my adulthood, I think it was Nick and another person from my childhood church that really helped me to kind of have a reconnection to my home church because there was a season where I was really just trying to explore how to meet those needs that felt more soul satisfying, the emotional and relational needs that I had outside of the church. But with the help of friends that were very compassionate and understood kind of the context for my uh, being where I was, I think that was the first step for me to see, like, oh, like it's safe to be known in my mistake filled place and still find fellowship. The second point was just in seminary, I was really struck by kind of meeting people from a lot of different backgrounds, seeing students that were similar to me, but also many that were not, and having textbooks and like scripture read, really emphasizing kind of the humanity of Christ. And I think I didn't realize how much of my upbringing I had felt like, the human things that are like, my body, my, identity as an Asian American or my gender as a woman, like all of these different things are kind of like not, I wasn't self-reflective about. And so I didn't realize how much of me felt like, to be spiritual means to kind of not think about those things and to just care about these things that I want to be like in character or in godliness. And so I think the connection of seeing, like Christ's full humanity really was a light bulb for me to feel like, my humanness, my pain and grief, my joy and excitement, my feelings, my medical needs, my health and well-being, like that matters to God. And that was like, I had never thought of that before. I really felt like I had sort of taken in this perspective that spiritual meant like not really about me as a human. And there were a lot of competing messages about being human-centered versus God-centered. And it felt like a competition of like, am I going to be more spiritual, which means not focused on human needs. So I think it was a paradigm shift for me to invite that idea that, Jesus' full humanity is part of, what wellness and wholeness looks like as me. Um, and then finally, I would say, I think the other touch point was just really, again, trusting God with my emotions, my hurts relationally, my social identity questions. That was like a big part of my life. I realized when Nick became a pastor, there was a turning point where I realized, I was kind of running away from the Chinese church for a while because I felt like so many emotional complexities were living in that space for me. But then when I realized, there are a lot of people that are in my same generation that have these same exact like emotional quandaries, I felt like, like God kind of changed me to want to seek out like what is his heart for intergenerational healing? What is his heart for um, grounding our identity? What is his heart for this particular generational need? So I think that started to make me curious about, what does this look like in an Asian American Christian context? That was like what motivated me to go into the mental health field, practically speaking. And then also when Nick went into the pastor, I remember going to this there was at Dallas Seminary, there was a woman, like a advisor to women who were married to pastors. So I think I saw her, I was like ready to take notes. I was like, what do I need to know to kind of get my headset on to be a ministry spouse? And then I think I was just really struck by her asking somewhere in the slew of us getting acquainted. She just said, do you feel like you can emotionally trust God? And I feel like at the time, I didn't have a lot of words. I didn't have an understanding of what that meant for me personally, but I just started crying in her office. And I was very struck by how I never associated my emotional life with God. I just did not. I always thought of God provides for me. I have a right way of living. I need to be serving people. I need to make sure that I'm not, I'm managing different possible pitfalls. I'm making good choices in how to be a giver to others. So I was always very focused on my service to God or my rightness of thinking or belief or my just, yeah, I guess mostly being a giver, being someone who was helping the community. I never really realized that my life matters to God, my inner life. And so I think that was where I realized, I don't even know where to go with that. And so it began a quest for me to ask God those questions, like, what does that mean as someone who's very used to being representational? Like my family is known in the community. Now I'm married to a pastor. Like I don't know how to do vulnerability. Like I just don't. Like I just show up and I'm supposed to host. I'm showing up and I'm supposed to give. I don't really know the parts of me that people don't interact with me about. So I think that was really a quest of learning for me. And I want to turn the time over to Nick as well. So I'll just say that I'm open to question and answer. I had some in mind, like some things that I've found useful, but I want to make sure I just tune into kind of what's most on the hearts of you all. But I can speak from this vantage point of just my personal journey, which I have my ministry journey of just noticing what a lot of parishioners are sharing with me, especially as a pastor's spouse. I often am privy to some of the challenges that people have and how much of their self can they freely really bring to God or bring to the church. I can also share thoughts just as a therapist working in the mental health profession, but I want to save time for Nick. So entertain questions later or dialogue. But thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Natalie, for leading us out and sharing openly about your experiences. And thanks, DJ and Pastor Jin, for hosting and giving us the chance to share today some of our thoughts. I'm really grateful to be able to kind of share this time with Natalie because I feel like we have similar passions and convictions about this topic, but we approach them from very different angles. I've since high school, I've had an interest in mental health and mental health care. And like Natalie, I was a psychology major in undergrad. I used to joke that the way that we approach that, like our college majors, reflected the difference in our personalities because we both, were psychology majors, but Natalie would be more interested in kind of talking about your background and your experiences and your feelings and thoughts, and I would be more interested in looking at your brain scans. And so
Nice.
we've moved a little closer to one another over the years in terms of how we approach mental health and mental health care too. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting. We both have an interest in that, but my interest in psychology has mainly been biopsych, psychopharm, and social psychology. Um, anyway, so I've always had an interest in mental health and mental health care, and I've also had some firsthand personal experience with mental health challenges and mental health care. I grew up experiencing panic attacks for most of my childhood. I didn't realize actually that it wasn't normal. It was just something that occurred to me, that happened to me, and that I didn't talk about with anybody. And so I didn't know that people didn't just, every couple of weeks, just have a small panic attack they had to deal with. Um, and my earliest recollection of panic was during a really high fever. So I kind of trace it back to possibly something that happened there. I had this really high fever when I was a kid. I experienced hallucination and disturbed perception. And from that time on, I would periodically have panic episodes, probably every couple of weeks or so. Um, and this went on for a long time, until the middle of college. And I also, beginning in middle school, started having major depression periods of major depression coupled with suicidal ideation. And that started in middle school and carried on through part of college. And in college, I had this really major panic episode. Now, typically, the panic episodes I had experienced from childhood on were um, they were relatively small and didn't last very long. Um, but this one that I experienced in college was like a major episode. It happened in two waves, and I didn't fully come down from it for weeks. And that ultimately drove me to seek professional care. And I ended up on psychotropic medication for a while. I was able eventually to wean off of it and have only had a few isolated panic attacks since then. Although some have been pretty significant, including one that I'll refer to in a little bit that happened when I was in ministry and involved me getting transported to the hospital by ambulance. But I'll refer to that incident in a little bit. um, anyway, so I have both in terms of education and in terms of personal experience had some intersection with mental health and mental health care, mental health issues and mental health care. The irony, of course, that when I had my sort of really major panic episode in college, one of the classes I was taking that quarter was abnormal psychology. So I was going through this class, learning about these mental health issues and disorders, and then having a mental health crisis myself. Um, As an aside, if you or someone you know needs psychotropic medication, it's really important to see a psychiatrist who is an expert at managing medication. I've heard countless negative experiences with psychotropic meds that are largely due to poor patient education and mismanagement of the medication. A good medication manager will not guarantee a positive experience, but a poor medication manager will almost certainly guarantee a negative experience, or at least make it very, very likely. And so, yeah, I would just recommend finding somebody who's very familiar with psychopharmacology if you need to, and managing the medication for patients if you need to, either to refer to someone or seek medication yourself. Anyway, my educational background in theology and psychology, as well as my personal experience, they give me perspective from both sides of the mental and spiritual health divide. And they lead me to see the importance of whole person spirituality that respects the realities of both mental health and spiritual health dynamics. So that's kind of some relevant parts of my background. I wanted to share a few steps that would be kind of practical steps for developing whole person spirituality as a culture of whole person spirituality. And the first thing really is that it goes back to DJ's 5S structure: the sermon, story, seminar, support groups, and Sabbath, which she shared about on the blog, as well as I think you've shared about that with churches in person as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's a really helpful kind of model for practical steps that churches can take, that ministers can take, to bring your ministry in the direction of establishing a whole person spirituality culture. I think also as leaders and pastors, being able to own and share your own experiences with mental health care. Especially in the Asian church, it's often difficult to acknowledge that we have mental health issues. And given the hierarchical kind of nature of Asian churches and Asian culture, the freedom to talk about those things really has to begin at the top. And so if we want to have a culture that invites whole person spirituality, we've got to, as pastors and leaders, be willing to share our own struggles, however great or small they may be, but to acknowledge them. When you do that, it creates opportunities for people to come to you and feel like they're safe to talk to you about the struggles that they have. I would say, kind of related to that, be encouraged when people bring their real issues and respond to them out of courage rather than out of fear or shame. I think our culture kind of conditions us to respond fearfully or to respond with a sense of shame for the other person if they acknowledge having mental health issues that they're struggling with. And if we can be intentional to develop a response that's welcoming and understanding, and not from a place of fear or shame, that can really help create a culture of that welcomes whole person spirituality and the acknowledgement of the mental health dynamic. I'll give you a negative example and a kind of a positive example. There's one time so I mentioned I was going to refer to this serious panic attack. So I had this panic attack during the week, and then by the time we got to the weekend, I was well enough to be at church. So I did, regular ministry, went to meetings. And then after church and after the meetings, there was a lay leader that came up to me as I was walking to the parking lot and kind of asked how I was, heard that I had had a panic attack and gone to the hospital, and wanted to see if I wanted to talk about it. But I was kind of in a hurry at that particular moment and distracted by something else. And so I said, "Oh, yeah, I'm okay. I don't really want to talk about it right now." And I left. But in hindsight, I realized that was an opportunity to at least set a time to meet and to share openly about what I had experienced. And who knows if that person might have also had struggles or questions that he didn't know how to bring up, but thought I might have been a safe person because I just had this experience, right? So I kind of looking back, I regret not having the presence of mind and foresight to kind of at least set a time. I was in a hurry at that moment, but I could have set a time to meet with him later and talk about it. On the other hand, the fact that I had this panic attack and had them in the past gave me the opportunity to be a listener to a parishioner who struggled with panic attacks and felt like no one else understood her. And so she, I think, approached Natalie first, maybe, and then the two of us sat down with her, and I was able to listen to her and kind of affirm some of the experiences and kind of help her put words to some of her experiences. But yeah, she just the thing that struck me was that she really felt like she didn't have anybody to talk to because she didn't feel like, one, that she knew how to describe her experience, and then consequently, two, that anyone else ever understood her when she explained what she was going through. And so the fact that I'd had this experience helped her to feel like she could talk with me. And I've had a number of pastors over the years tell me that, they see congregants coming up with serious personal and relational issues. And in those times, I try to remind them that, you should be encouraged when that happens. You might be tempted to feel like, oh goodness, why is God giving me all these burdens to kind of bear? Why is my church suddenly hit with all of these challenges? But be encouraged, because the reality is we're broken people. We live in a broken world, and these real issues, they're there whether people are bringing them to us or not. And so if people are bringing them to you, it's a sign that they trust you and that they feel like your ministry is a safe place to be able to disclose these things, and that you're going to point them to the Lord in a way that's going to acknowledge their challenges, rather than just say you need to buckle down and kind of get your act together, or pray more, or do more of what they're already doing, probably, that isn't working for them. And so just and we don't necessarily have to have solutions, but just or at least not instantaneous ones, but just to have a space where people feel safe, that they can be in the presence of God with the trials and struggles that they have, including their mental health struggles. And then be cognizant of the difference between spiritual and mental health struggles and temptations and issues. So one thing I've noticed is that people tend to only think in categories of one or the other, and then to overgeneralize, sometimes resulting in harm to the people that we're trying to minister to. And so it's important to be aware of and to be learning from the other side, as it were. And so it's often the case that mental health professionals will tend to assume that a client's issues are entirely psychological, or at best maybe biopsychosocial. But they will neglect or even discount the spiritual dimension and kind of reduce it to a subset of the client's cultural practices. And so then the influence of a real spiritual realm and reality is usually not considered. On the flip side, in the church, it's often the case that spiritual practitioners, pastors or parishioners that take their faith seriously, will often dismiss the mental health field as irrelevant or downright dangerous, and live in denial of mental health challenges, or attribute their mental health struggles to insufficient spiritual discipline, to sin, or to spiritual warfare. And I've had parishioners who recognize they have issues, who clearly could benefit from therapy or possibly medication, but who insist that their issues are due to spiritual attacks or to demonic forces. And where I've been with them and tried to minister to them, and I'm no expert on demonology, but the reactions that they give to the kind of the spiritual practices that we engage in do not give me the sense that there's any real demonic activity. And so, yeah, it just, the fact that they're insistent that that's what's happening and not willing to consider the mental health dimension is denying them access to healing and freedom. And so we need to be willing to acknowledge the spiritual forces at play, but also to acknowledge the mental health realities at play as well. And that's particularly true for anxiety disorders, like OCD, a common form of which is this thing called scrupulosity, which is common with people in religious settings. People will have obsessions or compulsions that are connected to the practice of their faith. And so then their anxiety becomes intertwined with their personal spirituality, and it becomes very, very difficult for them, and even for others trying to help them, to kind of untangle those things. But the idea is we need to be aware. right? Aware that these things are real and are present and are factors if we want to develop a culture that invites whole person spirituality. So I have some resources that I would recommend. Um, I'll just make a quick cut and paste here into the chat. But I can forward these to you by email if you would be interested. But these are some resources just as starting points. I mean, we're reading these things, not going to make you expert in any of it. I'm certainly no expert, but they're good starting points. Pete Scazzero's got a whole series of emotionally healthy stuff related to spirituality, leadership, spirituality, discipleship. But this is the book that started it, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and I recommend it. There's Ted Witzik. He's a licensed clinical counselor, and he has this thing on addressing OCD and Christianity. And so this is an introduction to the idea of scrupulosity. It's helpful, I think, for pastors, especially to be aware that this is a factor that could be at play. Obviously, the fact that someone's struggling with something doesn't mean that they automatically need professional mental health care. But there are certain things that are kind of signs that it's more than just the typical spiritual struggle that someone's going through, and that it could be some subset of OCD or some other anxiety disorder that they should kind of be seeking help with, or some other mental health issue that they could benefit from mental health care. Also, I would recommend Jonathan Edwards, A Treatise Concerning Religious Affections. And this is because kind of related to scrupulosity. Like I think in Christian circles, we have, and perhaps in American evangelicalism in particular, we have a tendency to mistake certain emotional impacts for the work of the Holy Spirit. And the work of the Holy Spirit sometimes has emotional impact, but the emotional and even physical impact is often an attendant circumstance rather than the work of the Spirit himself. And so it's good to be able to discern, what are unreliable signs of the work of the Spirit in a person's life? In other words, it could be or it could not be a sign that the Spirit's at work. And what are reliable signs of a Spirit's work in a person's life? And that's exactly, Jonathan Edwards spent his life kind of his ministry was kind of in the midst of the First Great Awakening, and he was really excited about the impact that it had in terms of bringing revival, but then was really concerned to see people who seemed to be really passionate about the Lord then fall away a few years later. And so anyway, he wrote this as his sort of magnum opus. And if it seems that, the Puritans' writing, it can be a little bit difficult to access. If you'd like something a little more modern and up to date in terms of language, Gerald McDermott's Seeing God, Jonathan Edwards and Spiritual Discernment is basically a modern rephrasing with modern illustrations of Edwards' argument in religious affection. So I would commend these to you. Again, just starting points, but I think they're valuable resources.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Natalie, for sharing your perspectives about whole person spirituality and community. We have time to interact with Nick and Natalie. So anyone with comments, questions, or perspective, please chime in.
Well, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Nick. Natalie, you have a special gift as a teacher counseling the school system and as a, person of faith, and then you have some expertise in your training in being a therapist. So I work with a lot of young people, high school, middle school. I have a middle school and a high school kid. It's very challenging these days to help them in their mental health, and they're going through it. So yet, as a person of faith, you and I know that there's some things that ground us and talk about identity rather than finding their identity in Christ and not in their ethnicity. And so, how would you guide someone, a parent, or as someone that works with youth, as they're going through this, maneuvering this journey, and this all, kind of segregated, right? It's not holistic for them. They're still forming that. So any advice, guidance, and that?
Yeah, no, I love that question. So you're talking about if you are in the church working with parents and child, and then maybe they're teenagers or youth and parents. Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a great question. I mean, I think that I think that often I really like to create space for there to be multiple perspectives on any moment in time. So, like, if I were to see someone in my room who's here on a school campus in a church setting, there's maybe an issue that's struggling for them right now. Maybe they're really having conflicts at home, or they're feeling like so low energy, no motivation. I just don't really want to do anything. Or it could be that they're very withdrawn, or maybe they're having behavior issues. So I try to understand, the way I approach it is I often try to understand the person um, with the concern. So I try to understand, this concern is in a context. It's in, what's happening in life right now. So I try to take that approach. So I definitely take in, what is your understanding of, what's concerning on your heart today? And that usually parents are very vocal about, this is the issue, like we can't motivate, the child, or we're having these problems. So then I take that in. I try to create space for different family members to have a perspective. Um, I think depending on the dynamic between the parent and the child, I might have an individual time with the child, an individual time with the parent. But then looking for, how can we team up with the struggle and be teammates together? How do I bring us instead of I guess so. Yeah, I realize I'm like flying a little blind because I'm like, oh, it'd be easier if I knew exactly like a situation, then I could respond more specifically. But I think my approach would be to really locate, where is the struggle being felt for the child, for the family? Because sometimes they're felt very differently. And kind of allowing there to be multiple ways of understanding and feeling a situation. Um, I like to also help normalize, like there are seasons when we'll struggle, and to look at, what's happening in life. What are the messages that the child is receiving at school, at church? What is their understanding of their life right now? What's the stressors on the parent's mind? Helping them look outside as well. Like, what are the stressful things that you're encountering? Like maybe there's financial stress, maybe there's work stress, maybe there's like peers that are not getting along with the student, or there's like feeling just like messages from teachers, peers, or like, what's happening in the environment of parent, what's happening in the environment of the students so that they can build compassion to say, oh, I see that, mom's really concerned because of this, or like build that sort of compassion across the relationship. But then also, so I think creating space for each person to understand the situation in their own way, creating a path for to be able to show compassion and understanding across these different roles. It depends, I think, what exactly the struggle is, like kind of where I would direct things from there. I think that's kind of the starting point, I would say. Like I take in the concern, but I also look for the person in it. I look for, where are they really hurting? Like what are their hopes? Like, and sometimes just to help build a vision for, what does success look like from working with me, I might ask a question like, what if tomorrow you woke up and, this struggle wasn't there? Like what would life look like? So then that helps me to tap into their motivation or their sense of their heart, like what is meaningful for that person. So maybe a parent might be like, we get along better, or my child's motivated to do the things that I think are really good for my child. They'd want to connect to the spiritual community. They'd want to be doing well in school. They'd want those things. Maybe that's the parents' like wish. What is it for the child? Maybe it's going to be the same thing. Maybe it's something completely different. And then I start to say like, oh, like what's going to really meet the need for that child is to feel like, okay, I feel supported at home, or I feel supported by people around me. I'm not so lost, like maybe. And so I think those are the ways that I try to just aim, but then I think each specific case would be different. on what particular topics we're talking about.
Thank you, Natalie.
One quick technical correction. I'd earlier said that Ted Witzig is a clinical counselor. He's actually a licensed clinical psychologist.
And what would be the difference in that?
That is a
Yeah,
good
oh,
question.
clinical psychologist. The professional world. I mean, something I didn't throw in because I was like too worried that we would not have enough time. I think for me, just I'll throw in like some things that might help in terms of creating culture. I think Nick spoke about some of the like being transparent about certain things on your own life. I think what I also do in my time, like helping build community in church settings, is really to normalize like seasons of life. There are going to be seasons of pain and struggle. There are times of joy. We share both in community. So just really putting language to saying like, we have praises and prayer requests, and those are commonly heard words, but just really allowing there to be a space for like lament, grief. I often talk to people that are in grief that may be a bereavement grief. It might be a different kind of grief, and they often feel like very awkward to come to church because we're not usually good at grieving in community and giving words to saying, you know what, I just really don't feel okay today. Like I just am really sad. Or I'm really struggling, not because I need help with a problem, but because my mood is just really low. Like I think just normalizing in some form or fashion that, we're showing up to church. Like what really matters, I believe, to worship is that we're fully present, not that we're fully like doing well necessarily, but that we're fully offered to God. And so I kind of reframe it to people when I've done women's ministry or community conversations, like just saying that, all of life belongs to God. So I like to highlight biblical stories where I have been really moving to me. We actually named our daughter Naomi because we're like, how many books really show us that God cares about your grief? And I think Naomi does. Like, there's not this condemnation over the fact that she's like really bitter. She's really hurting. Her whole life has been turned upside down and she has like no livelihood and no relational connection. She's like obviously depressed, right? Just normalizing like that's a natural human response to having so much trauma and grief and just saying like, no wonder you're so bitter. Like that makes sense. Just saying like that makes sense that we're going to have days like that. And I think for me, I was really scared to like open up about our story because our family has been going through the ringer. Like, I think being a parent, you throw on a lot of anxiety as a parent, but then suddenly, like, we were, kind of suddenly medical parents. Like, we had like so much overwhelm, and I felt like God was telling me, you know what, you're going to minister out of your vulnerability. You're going to minister out of the things you have no idea how to bear. Those are the ways that I want you to be open to sharing and helping minister is not from a place of necessarily knowing how to hold it all, but it's really just saying, you know what? All these pieces don't make any sense, but I'm coming to God with them. Like I'm coming to God with all of these pieces. And I just feel like I've become a little tad more comfortable just saying, not just throwing it in and saying, who cares? But it's really just saying, like, you know what? I don't know how all of these pieces line up, but I'm fully present giving them to God. And just like promoting that awareness of whole self, presented to God is not things put together well necessarily, but saying, these pieces of my life all belong to you. And God, use the hurting places, the good places, help me to be an encourager to you, expecting the community to have that where someone is strong so they can fill up me who's like way empty, or me being someone who's in pain, being able to speak a word of saying, I see you to that person over there who's in pain. Just allowing the language of the community to help us to normalize like that we're going to be in different spaces, places, and that we worship out of that.
Thank you. Thank you, Natalie and Nick, for sharing with us God's invitation for all of us to
Mhm.
show up before God, and that it is even possible in Asian American churches.
That's right.
Just opening that conversation. So thank you so much for that. And we'll add links in the description so that people can reach out to you, Nick and Natalie, for follow-up conversations. I'll turn it over the rest of the time to my colleague, Jen Lee, to close out our time.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Nick. I really enjoyed it. I could stay longer to just ask more questions.
Yeah.
But just grateful for everyone here and just taking the time, learning and growing and creating this space. We do have these monthly, and so it's the last Thursday, I believe, of each month. Look out for um, the email that DJ puts out. And um, but I do want to share a resource that we are engaging in the month of May. Month of May is Asian American and Mental Health Month, and we are doing an Asian parenting series to equip our parents that are maneuvering parenting, their kids, and mental health. And so we've brought some experts to do 5 talks, each one 1 hour each, and because parents are very busy, so we're trying to do 1 hour and keep it. These experts will talk about different topics that are relevant. So please, if it's meaningful or helpful to your church, we appreciate you just sharing that and amplifying it through your email, your flyers at um, church and programs. We'd be grateful. We're looking forward to it, but it's a challenge, and as you know, gathering people online. But we're gonna make it a step of faith of that space that I think that we as a church can minister to. But we'll see what the Lord does, and we want to come outside the church box and minister where they're at. And the conversation I continue to have with a lot of parents are just struggling how to be better parents, how to deal with their kids, and it's just always at the surface of all the conversation I'm having. And I think I'm not the only one, and others. So it's getting lonely, and as you know, Asian America are very private and shameful to talk about quote unquote problems. And so we're just trying to create the space and help and support as best we can. So I appreciate your support and your help in this. Thank you, DJ, always for making this space, and thank you, Nick and Natalie, for sharing your journey
Yeah.
with us. Thank you, Barry and Michael, for being a fan to attend.
That's right.
And thank you.